All right, so let's move on to closing a recessionary gap. So remember, a recessionary gap is when your potential GDP is higher than your actual GDP, okay? Okay. So in a recessionary gap, the ideal case for like a self-correcting mechanism would be, okay, so we have a recessionary gap, okay? What we really want is we want supply to shift out and close that recessionary gap, all right? Okay, so there's two ways supply could shift out, okay? It could either be, you could either have a more efficient workforce, right? Let me just do this real quick. I don't want that. Okay, so we are here, and it's disappeared. Where is it? Come on. So profits per unit. Okay. So profits per unit is the ultimate driving force for supply. Equals price minus input cost divided by productivity. Okay. So it would shift supply out if price goes down. Okay. If price goes up, input costs go down, productivity goes up, or if the workforce increases. So like you have just population, like massive population growth in the time period that there would be a recession. Okay, so you can kind of nix this one here off the top because people aren't going to turn 18 en masse just magically enough for you to get out of your recession. Okay, and those that do are going to be kind of screwed because they still need a job to have in order to increase their workforce, right? And that just because you turn 18 doesn't mean that you're automatically going to find a job or you're going to create your own business and shift the supply curve out, right? Things need to actually happen. So that's not really an option. Okay, what about productivity going up? It could be the case that productivity increases in time of a recession. That would be very lucky. It would probably decrease the time frame for a recession, but that's, like I said, really lucky. It's not guaranteed to happen. There's no internal mechanism that makes productivity go up happen. Okay, productivity doesn't really depend on the business cycle. So if things are good, productivity could be good or bad, or productivity change in productivity could be good or bad, I should say. It really just depends on, who's being innovative that particular time period. So that's not automatically going to happen. Okay. Price goes up. Well, price is a part of the model, right? Price is a part of the supply curve. That's not going to shift the supply curve out. Okay. So really you're left with input costs go down. All right. What are your input costs? Capital, wages, let's say the cost of capital, the interest rate, wages, okay, and your technology, which we already kind of took out, right? So essentially, you really need your interest rate to decrease. so that the cost of borrowing goes down, allowing for firms to have more capital. However, in recessions, firms are still pretty unlikely to engage in buying capital en masse, right? Basically, if you have a recession, you're expecting your inventory to kind of build up, so you're not going to be really making a whole lot of investments. Nonetheless, policymakers will try to decrease interest rates and kind of spur along lending, but and investment, but that's not really super effective. Okay, and interest rates are effective for other reasons, but we'll get into that. But really, what you're banking on is that wages are going to drop, right? But we've talked about this before. Wages are downward price sticky. Okay, you don't usually give people demotions because of COVID, right? That'd be really kind of screwed up. At least that's how we perceive it. Even if it means, even if you can try to tell people, hey, look, I know you got kids in college and you're working really hard, but I'm gonna cut your pay because of business cycle reasons, right? It's not really gonna fly, even if it means that same company doesn't fire someone else who might also have kids in college or whatever. Okay, you really kind of can't get away with that for psychological reasons or contract based reasons or whatever. People don't really take too kindly to having their pay cut. So aggregate supply probably isn't going to shift out on its own. Okay. So we kind of got to be a little clever. So I'm going to get back to the slides because I've kind of jumped the gun a little bit, but that's essentially the story we're dealing with. Okay, so ideally we would have deflation, which is going to shift aggregate supply out. Okay, so cut wages, shift aggregate supply out, get back to potential GDP. I don't know why I'm making it smaller or lower. It could just be over here. But not really easy to do. Okay. So that would be the self-fulfilling mechanism is deflation, but it's not really going to work because prices are downward sticky. Okay, so this scenario doesn't really happen very frequently in the real world, depending on what the kind of scholar you're talking to buys into. But most, I should caveat that because there are some scholars who believe that wages are not downward price sticky. That would be your real business theory, modern monetarist kind of people, a real business cycle theory. Yeah, that's not the majority of economists though, and I don't think that's a strong reason. Like, I think they put too much faith in the market to self-correct, and y'all see it, right? Even in this recession that we have now, right? I've still seen, like, it still feels like there's inflation. I don't know if y'all are paying as much attention to it as I am, but prices seem higher to me. So that's my 2 cents. Anyway, so just talking about deflation for a second. All right. So first of all, it's just generally not that seen. Central banks go to great lengths to prevent deflation. Okay, so potentially you could have just you could have deflation as a self-correcting mechanism, but it's painful for some. I think it's overhyped, but anyway. So deflation essentially lowers your incentive to invest in new projects and capital. Remember, inflation is good for borrowers, deflation is good for lenders, right? If I borrow today, so if I invest in a new project, so let's say I go to grad school, right, and I pay up front, okay, and I expect at the end of grad school that I'm going to be gifted with this fancy new check, okay. If I invest today in myself, I make a physical, a monetary investment that I have to pay off with student debt. The student debt burden is going to decrease over time because of inflation. So even though I'm paying a fixed amount, let's say $1,000 a month, right? Let's say I'm paying $1,000 a month for my debt, okay, over a 15-year period. I guess I'm going in mortgage territory now. All right, so let's do mortgages then, because whatever. So let's say I'm paying a fixed $1,000 a month towards my house, okay, expecting that, that once I'm done building the house, I can eventually do something productive with it, like live in it, which is, utility inducing. I like living in the house. Or I could rent it out or whatever. Okay, that's tracking towards investment, right? So if I pay a mortgage to that, and the mortgage has fixed payments of $1,000 a month for 30 years, well, today's payment is going to feel a lot harder than the payment 30 years from now. Why? Because even if I make the same amount of money, or the same real wage in 30 years, okay, the payment that I make on the fixed payment of $1,000 in 30 years is going to go through years and years of inflation, such that it's probably going to feel less like $1,000 and more like $100. Okay, that's actually not unreasonable. We can even do the calculation if you want. Okay, so in one year, it's going to, I'm sorry, this is really small. In 1 year, it's going to feel like $980, okay, if it's a 2% inflation. Okay. In 8 years, it's going to feel like $870, right? At the end of the term, it's only going to feel like half the payment, okay? On the other hand, if I'm a borrower, if I'm in deflation and I'm borrowing, okay? So essentially the price level is decreasing. In 30 years, if the price level is dropping by 2% every year, I've almost doubled my payment, $17.96. It's a hefty difference. So if I know that I'm going to be in a deflationary environment, I'm less likely to want to invest, okay, or make a physical investment or whatever, okay. So that's what I just said. Also, I think there's a consumption element to deflation, because even though you actually feel richer, right? You feel you have more purchasing power. If you keep feeling like the price level is going to drop, you're going to actually decrease your consumption today, expecting that, like, hey, in 2 years, this fancy new house is going to be, house is bad. Well, yeah, house can be a consumption good if it's not a new house. In 2 years, this fancy new house can be, half the, could be half of my real earnings, essentially. Okay, that was an extreme example. Let's say that half, but your real earnings will outpace the price of the house. Okay. All right, and like I said, in the real world, wages and prices rarely fall. Okay, there's resistance to wage reduction. There's institutional factors like contracts and unions. Okay, business cycles nowadays are less severe than they had been. I think part of that is because of good policy responses. We have more like tools in our quiver, or arrows in our quiver. We don't keep tools in the quiver. Hawkeye would not be very, very pleased if he kept tools in his quiver. Okay, so firms and labor markets tend to expect recessions to be over shortly. In fact, if you look at the 2008 recession, it was done within like I think a year and a half about, and then we just never really met. So the recession was done in the sense of recession is 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP. We never met our potential GDP until like 2013, something like that. But we were out of the quote unquote recession and back into growth pretty quickly. The pandemic is another example. We were pretty much out of the pandemic by the end of the quarter. Or not out of the pandemic. We were out of the recession. It was like what they call a V-shaped recovery. But it obviously didn't feel like that because we didn't meet our potential GDP. So we were growing by third quarter of 2020, but we didn't feel like it because we lost so much in the first and second quarter of 2020, particularly right around the cusp of the end of the second quarter, end of the first quarter. Okay. So if you expect wages and prices to fall on their own and the economy to be self-correcting, you can be caught in a recessionary gap for a long period of time. So policymakers need to kind of do something about that, right? One of the big macroeconomist people, like of all time, maybe the biggest macroeconomist of all time, even though he's kind of like old at this, like he's dead old at this point. He's writing in the 30s and 40s, but his name is John Maynard Keynes. So you might hear me talk about New Keynesianism or post Keynesianism, or neo Keynesianism. So his ideas are still essentially the mainstream ideas. They're just mathematized. But he had this famous quote: "The market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent." The idea being that you can be in a recession for a lot longer than you can survive the recession. Okay, so that's why he kind of came up with his plan of policy. He was essentially the guy who came up with wage stickiness and all the kind of stuff we've been talking about. He's like one of the like really truly big people within economics. But that's why he came up with some policy prescriptions, and that's why policies in the 40s, 30s, and 40s were so kind of revolutionary relative to what they had been doing before, where they were just waiting for deflation to happen, and increasing the length of the recession. Okay. So the self-correcting mechanism is slow, so we kind of have to do fiscal and monetary policy to counteract that, and we'll talk about that later. Inflationary gaps, on the other hand, are kind of shorter. That's why you didn't see as many of them. Okay, so in an inflationary gap, you have and I've already kind of talked about this, but you have a tight labor market. Let me start over. An inflationary gap is where equilibrium GDP outpaces potential GDP. So essentially you're doing better than your potential, but that has a cost to it, and that cost is inflation. Okay, so your equilibrium is better than your potential, right? You therefore need workers. You have a lot of jobs, but low supply of labor, so you need to pay them higher wages in order to attract new workers. That's going to increase the business cost, which is then going to lead to a price increase. That price increase is inflation. That's why it's an inflationary gap. Okay. In that case, aggregate supply is going to shift inwards, as I showed you before, leading to a GDP decrease that moves it along closer to your potential GDP. Okay. So that is a self-correcting mechanism, and it's not painless either. I would say it's better than a recession. There's like this concept of like the pain or the misery index within economics, which is you take your unemployment, you add it to inflation, and then you add those two numbers up, and people generally find that unemployment hurts a lot more than inflation, which it's like no duh, right? So you'd rather be in regular inflation, not hyperinflation, than be unemployed. Okay. But anyway, you can see the supply function is contracting in because input costs have risen because you need higher wages, leading to higher prices and a lower equilibrium GDP closer towards your potential. Okay. In this case, the inflationary gap has been fully corrected for, and now you're just at potential GDP, which is ACEs. Okay. Though you do have higher prices. All right, let me stop here and then we'll talk about stagflation.